I was just so impressed with her teaching and what she was talking about. Laraine is not only an author, but she is a teacher as well. And she also does writing workshops and book coaching, I should say, for women who
Mhm.
are over 40, which is also very cool.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about yourself?
I'm also a grief therapist. And I do work also with women over 40 through grief balloons coaching.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So let's talk about A Constellation of Ghosts. So, where did the idea for this memoir come from?
I I didn't get an idea for the memoir. That's always such a challenging question to answer. I don't think we sit around on hills, kind of waiting for, it arrived, I if only it were that easy. I I really was stuck after I had cancer and I didn't actually thought I probably wouldn't write anything else, that I had probably done my writing for my life and was moving
Mm,
into something else. Because the everything that I had known to do before no longer was working for me in terms of writing, and the things and the type of work that I was doing didn't seem to be holding together in any way.
mm,
And it turned out that that whole process was part of what I think made the book come together as a whole, like going through that falling apart and um, metaphorically falling apart,
right.
and uh, so yeah, I didn't get an idea for it. I just like slogged through trying to find myself again.
Wow. Very interesting. So you were diagnosed with colon cancer,
Hmm.
correct? And was that in 2017?
That's right. Yeah. Hmm.
2017. Okay. Yeah, and so I know that a lot came up for you around your father's death from many years before, and it was almost like you were facing, for facing your own mortality, but then also facing, it seems like a lot of unprocessed grief from your father's passing. Is that how
Hmm.
you would describe that?
That's a great way to describe it. And I think that was also part of the surprise, because I have done grief work for so long, and you think like, wow, I've done it, I've done it. Now I'm working with other people. I've written about it. I really thought that, not that you're ever like done, I mean, when someone important to you is gone, there's always moments of grief and, and missing them and all of that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
I was really surprised to be like, wow, there is still like a huge piece um, around my dad's death that turned out to be so much more than that. It's almost like his that was the door in for me, but and I think in part because it was familiar. Like
Mhm.
I know how to go in and meet this, because I've tried to do it, therapeutically through writing, for many, many, many years. But into that got me into my grandparents and into the ancestral piece. And I think that was really the piece that needed to kind of come back around, together. And that was
Mhm.
another really big surprise.
So you had done writing around your father's passing throughout your life, is that?
Throughout
Yeah.
my life. The first book I published was called Lost Fathers: How Women Can Heal from Adolescent Father Loss, and that came out of my dissertation. I was studying the impact of, shockingly, absent fathers in some way, on intimacy in adult women. And that was
Mhm.
and of course I was looking at that because it was something that I was struggling with. And so that came out with Hazelden back in 2005 in the end. So my dad died in 87. And so, it's just been a kind of a constant, to the point where I'm like, I don't want to be the dead dad girl anymore. Like, I don't want to be known as the dead dad girl in my work and in my writing. Um, and now I don't feel like the dead dad girl. Now I feel like, you know, um, maybe the dad girl. I don't know, but not so much the, that this is all I have to say. I feel like it has opened up so much more for me.
Because I know your dad had passed when you were 19, is that
That's right.
right?
Hmm.
And so at the time, how do you feel like that affected you in your life?
Yeah, it was really not great. 19 is a really strange age for something like that to happen. And it wasn't until I went back to grad school and kind of looked at adolescent passages and, those types of things to get a better sense of really what's happening developmentally in people at that
Mhm.
time. But I was, like 1 foot out of the house because just you want to be out of the house and you want to be, doing college and doing all the stuff that everybody else is doing. But I'm sorry, but you're pulled back, um, into this place of grief and loss. And my dad had been sick for a long time. He had his first heart attack when I was 8 in 1976, and he wasn't ever able to work again after that. And so kind of there was a
Mm.
almost like a holding pattern for the 9 years after that he lived, where we uh 11 years, sorry, math is not my the time he lived after that. I don't teach math for the time I lived that.
Many times writing people are not
Oh,
math people.
math.
It doesn't necessarily go together, and
And my mom is a mathematician.
oh, how
So
interesting.
exactly. I know, I
Oh,
know.
goodness.
I know we had fun junior high conversations over this math stuff at the table. But anyway, our house was kind of in a holding pattern, waiting in a way, waiting for him to die,
Mm,
because we knew that it was coming, but we didn't know. It was part of why we moved to Arizona from North Carolina. Was at the time, Dr. Ted Dietrich was practicing in Phoenix, which is where we moved to, and he was performing the first open heart surgery. And so, I mean, it seems
wow.
hard to imagine that was but it was brand new, and this was in,
Yeah.
1979 or 80, something like that. We moved
Wow.
in 81, and in hopes that there would be better medical care and better opportunities for things than we were able to have in North Carolina. And he did have some surgeries down in Phoenix that I think helped and extended his life a little bit. But so it was so expected that he was going to die that I had made up all kinds of stories in my head about the day it would happen, about what I would do. And as I mentioned, in the book, I made up lies. I told people at school, in high school, that not that he had died necessarily, but I made up a brother that I didn't have, to just have an opportunity to, I think now looking back, an opportunity to just have someone to talk to about what was happening that I didn't have words for. My mom, to her credit, was really trying to preserve as much normalcy as possible. But for me, the impact of that was we never talked about anything. So I
Mhm.
would see my dad declining. I would hear everything was fine. And I, learned, I think, to not trust my own direct experience around things, which I think
Mhm.
contributed to the challenges that happened at 19 when he did die. Um, and I got involved with an abusive individual, and I went off to Tucson to go back to college. And I spent, I would say, probably 10 years really kind of, I wasn't with this man for 10 years, but I spent 10 years probably still in like suspended animation in a way.
Mhm.
And things with credit card debt, and really challenging with intimacy. And like, it was, I remember even saying like out loud, if I didn't know you before my dad died, you're not getting in. It was like that
Wow.
was the attempt to create safety.
Sure.
And so grad school was like a lifesaver to look to start to have language for this behavior, and language for grief, and not feel like I was somehow so like out in left field around everything. It was really liberating to start to find the language for the experience.
Well, let's back up just a second. You mentioned some of the lies that you told, and that was your way of beginning to talk about the experience or anticipating the experience of your father's death. And so I found that to be a really interesting aspect of the book. You say you had, a brother that you mentioned, invented brother,
Inventor
who
brother,
had passed in Vietnam, and also telling your friends that, that your dad was getting a heart transplant, and,
yeah.
some other things like that. So at that time, was it your feeling of almost like Tim O'Brien, the writer, says, who wrote, the things they carried, lying to get at a greater truth, or lying to, again, be able to begin to explore the idea of his passing, or what you couldn't quite cope with at the time.
And remember, he hadn't died yet. So this was
Right,
all like, anticipatory stuff. And I
right.
think, yeah, for sure, looking back on it with so much more understanding, that I think that was the motivation, but absolutely there was no conscious motivation. Like, I'm going to go to school and I'm going to make up the story. I just did it. Like, it was not a premeditated type of thing,
Right,
Um, but I definitely think that the unconscious attempt was, I need to find someone where I can at least feel sad and be allowed to feel sad, and I had great friends at school. I was shockingly a theater person.
right.
And so we were together in theater stuff forever, like you are in high school, making the show and doing the thing.
Mhm.
And so I felt really safe with those folks, um, and yeah, like, I definitely didn't intend to deceive. Like, it
Right,
was not about that. Um, and I've thought about it, like, in terms of a attempt to get attention, and I think there's an element to that, but that's not the whole piece either, because it was really just,
right,
I wanna I wanna talk about what I'm not allowed to talk about at home, and because I already knew I loved writing and I loved telling stories, and then you add that to theater, and then you add that to trauma. It's perfect breeding ground for, let's make a story, you
right.
know, and let's
Sure.
see what happens. Um,
Well, and especially when you were getting the message at home from your mom of everything
right,
is fine, and we're clinging,
right.
clinging to this message of everything is fine. It was maybe almost your way of saying, hey, everything's not fine, and I need to be able to start to talk about this with some people outside of my
Mhm.
house. So that's really interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think I really needed my experience to be validated so that I could trust myself, which is ironic to use a lie to find a way to trust yourself, you
Right,
know? It's
right.
it yeah.
I just found that to be a really intriguing, piece of the book, and just an interesting element there, that again, sometimes that lying to get at a greater truth, or lying to be able to start to formulate a story around this,
Mhm.
or around what's happening in your life. So I just found that really interesting.
Yeah, and when I started to teach at the college level, I was in my early 30s. It That was another kind of moment of new compassion for myself, because I felt really crappy about doing that. And I mean, it's like, what, I always feel like I was possessed by a totally different person for a few years, and which may be just what adolescence is all about, anyway. But
Right.
Um, but seeing how young my students were at 18, 19, when I was now out of that block of time, kind of helped me, like, man, you were just a kid. Like, you feel like you're an adult at 19, but you're not.
Right.
You feel like you know what you're doing, and so being able to be around people that age has been really a great gift for me, because it's really helped me see that they're you know they're kids, and you're different then.
I totally agree with that, and I feel like that is a piece of reality and acknowledgement that comes with aging, for sure, that when you look back, you just go, "Wow, I felt like I was so grown up," or I felt like, "Oh yeah, this is," I feel like an adult. I feel like, and like you said, when you look back, it really is more clear that you go, "Oh yeah, no."
Oh yeah,
Well,
no,
I didn't even know what I didn't know. I
you
didn't
don't know what you don't know. It's fun. And now I think I'm aware that I don't know what I don't know. But at 19, you're like, now, you're in a, you're the adult now. You can vote, you can drive, you can do all the things, and not really all the things.
Well, and clearly, you know, whenever a parent passes, that's going to be a very difficult thing in anyone's life, regardless of whatever that relationship was. But I
Mhm.
especially think at such a formative time like that, too, when you are just sort of on the verges of at
Right.
least technical adulthood, you know,
Right.
that then having that, and then as you said, it kind of led you into a bad relationship
Mhm.
with a man
Mhm.
too, and how that influenced your life. So it's really interesting. So when you say, you know, that the really important piece of this story is that it started to lead you into ancestral dynamics with your family. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how writing this memoir led you into that?
Um, my father's parents have always been kind of ghosty anyway. That
Can you describe that a little bit?
well,
Ghosting?
ghosty. They were old Southern family, you know, silent. My grandfather was very, very quiet. Um,
Mm,
and my grandmother was mean.
mm,
And part of we my dad grew up in Wilmington, which is on the coast of North Carolina, and we lived. I was born in Charlotte, which is about 4 hours to the west, and why we ended up there was to kind of get away from my grandmother. My dad and my grandmother had challenges, and so everything about being around them was obligatory, you know.
mm,
Um, we weren't around them a lot. They really did not like my mother. My mother was from New York, and so she was a Yankee coming down and taking I mean, this sounds so absurd. I mean, so they got married in 1964. Coming in and taking her son away from them. Um,
mm.
my mom was educated. She had a master's degree. That was not particularly a thing that was a good thing, you know.
Right, right.
Um, she was a threat to them on a lot of levels, uh,
Mm,
and yeah. So, uh, but it was clear how. I mean, obviously, they were my dad's parents, and how much they mattered and impacted him. And he had had polio as a child, so he was quarantined for, I want to say, almost a year and a half. He was in an iron lung,
wow.
um, and and I've wished he never talked about it. I mean, like there's like 3 or 4 lines I've found and things he's written. He just wanted that to be gone. He survived it. He was able to walk again. He had a limp, but he was able to walk. And he just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed through that with what must have been just an extraordinary will, you know.
Mm,
Um, and but after my grandmother died, which was later. I don't remember the exact year, um, 96 maybe. Anyway, my aunt sent a box of letters. My grandmother had saved all these letters that my dad had written to them, because that was what you do when you're the Southern son, right? You write every week. And to kind of put things in context too, this was still when long distance cost money.
mhm.
Like everything, you didn't just pick up the phone and call somebody who was somewhere else.
Right.
You just watch the money flying out, for every minute. And I mean, I remember, it's long distance, get off the phone,
Hurry
you
up
know,
and say hi before we have to hang up, and this costs
yeah,
$50.
I know. And now that's just like a data overage now. We're like, stop, get off the phone, go to unlimited data. And so so I got this giant box of all these letters that went all the way back to when he went off to college in the 60s, writing
Wow.
home. She had saved, must have been every single one of them. And so, kind of seeing that, even though they were more or less formal letters that didn't say a whole lot, kind of seeing that progression over the years gave me some insight into them, into that relationship. I really wanted um, to bring them together again in a different way. Um, my granddad was a very, very sweet man. He was just very quiet. Um, he was kind, and I've spent a lot of years trying to figure out my grandmother and trying to find a way to understand why she kind of was the way she was, at least in behavior to us, and to dad. But um, it's a mystery, the ancestral piece, I think. But I got interested in looking at inherited patterns, inherited trauma patterns, what we might inadvertently, carry with us from, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations back, and if we can, even if we can just imagine what that is, we can write a different story, which will shift energetically the relationships. I don't feel that our dead are fixed, that I feel like they continue to and are able to evolve, and our relationships with them can continue to evolve. And um, not that I have any declarative thing to say about where they are or what happens or anything like that. I'm not saying that I have that, but in terms
Right.
of living today, all I know is that I'm alive today in this place, and that I have people who helped make me be alive who are not here anymore. So whatever I can do to find more ease with that is going to help me live with greater ease here. And, you know, that I feel confident saying, but I don't know, I don't know where anybody goes. I wish I did.
Well, I feel like that's a really interesting question that you raise in the book when you start to talk about those inherited patterns, ancestral experiences that we individually may not have had ourselves, but that
Mm-hmm.
when you start to look at some of those things, and I know that there are different, terms for that, as far as, when if you're doing a chart that shows that, almost kind of like a, family history chart, but that it has to do with, and the name is escaping me right now. You might know that better than I do. Do you know
The
that?
intergenerational trauma, that type of that.
Well, it's called like a, I'm sorry, the name is totally escaping me. It's almost like genealogy, but it's another term of,
Oh, yes, yes, I do know.
but again, the
Yeah,
the
I
phrase is just
yeah,
going
yeah,
right out of my head right now. So I'm sorry. But essentially when you're looking at that, not only just to see, you know, family names and dates and things like that as you would with genealogy, but that when you have a sense about some of those people and some of the things that they may have experienced, whether it was, immigration or
right,
alcoholism or
exactly.
family abuse situations or whatever, and you kind of chart that, and you can start to see. I had attended like an organizational systems class one time that was just
Mhm.
fascinating, and it was very much, it pulled up like Eugene O'Neill's family, and, kind of charting like, here's his chart of this, and, this suicide and this mental illness and this alcoholism and all these things. And
Yeah.
then you start to look at that and see how, that influenced someone, again, even though that wasn't his direct experience. But then it also talked about that with regard to systems too, that those kinds of things also exist within systems. And,
Mhm.
whether it's, churches, organizations, companies, academic environments, whatever, that we may not always, have a memory around certain things or have experienced certain things ourselves, but it's more the atmosphere and the culture and all of those things that come into play. So when you talk about in your book how, science is beginning to explore this more, can you talk about that a little bit? There's a great passage in your book, and I don't have my phone in front of me, so I can't pull it up, but I know you talk about that.
The science is epigenetics,
Yes.
and but I'm gonna for sure say that I am not a scientist, so it's
Right.
not like I don't wanna don't wanna put any misinformation out about that, but I am trying to read all I can about that and look at that, because it's really fascinating, because it's beginning to prove what other spiritual traditions have, known for centuries, in terms of relating to the dead, relating to, to ancestors. And so the famous study is about nematode worms, which are teeny. They might even be single cell. Again, not a scientist. Teeny tiny things. And they
Teeny tiny things is fine here. We're
teeny
good with
tiny things. They're teeny tiny things. And we messed around with them in labs, and we did things. and and what they have revealed is that 12 generations forward, there are gene adaptations to trauma experienced by the original generation. So, they're applying. So, like if you, they did a lot with temperature, because they're tiny, they're teeny things, expose them to extreme cold or extreme heat, and what has to adapt genetically to, to ensure the survival of the worm. And then what kind of pattern would the worm respond to in later generations when exposed to a similar, type of trauma. And I think as we're beginning to understand that genes seem to be far more than just eye color, hair color. I mean, I remember in school it was the plants, and you like matched up, like how you get green eyes and how you get brown eyes and how, and it
Right.
was super simple, but it was so
Oh,
exciting. It was
yeah.
like, oh my God, this is how, genetics works. And now we're like, yeah, that is so not how genetics works. And I can only imagine in 20 years, we're going to be like, oh, this is, we've learned so much more about how genetics work. But we do know that there are genes that are connected to, behavioral traits, personality traits. And that's brand new information. And so they're applying this information a lot to, larger groups that have experienced intergenerational trauma, through colonialization, like Native Americans, through enslavement, like African Americans, through the Holocaust, different groups that just really collectively had a great deal of trauma. And if you go far enough back, every group was the subject of trauma in some way. You can keep
Absolutely.
going back. And that was one of the gifts of the work I did with Dr. Daniel Four, who was in the mountains of North Carolina. His practice is focused on ancestral medicine and ancestral healing, and being able to go back to, like, if you have ancestry in Ireland and Scotland, going back to the wars and the famines and the things that, everybody has both the colonize, someone who colonized, someone who enslaved, someone who was a slave, someone who, you kind of keep peeling it all back, and what moves forward, and what, suicides tend to run in families, and it's interesting to look at that from a almost more of a story based place, like what were the contributing factors to each of the individuals, how are they similar when you map them out? Can you see, it's almost like, and I wish I could prove this, but I can't. It's almost like the souls are stuck and are trying to, push through whatever that initial pattern was. There was a story that Dr. Ford told that really stuck with me about suicides in a family around men once they reached 19. And it went back so far. Not every man, obviously, or there would be nobody coming forward.
Right.
But within the family, just over and over and over again, this, you know, and could it be because we tell the story, so and so committed, completed suicide at this point, and that gets in our subconscious, and then that influences behavior, or is there something else going on more physiologically? It's mysterious and fascinating to me,
Absolutely.
and I think when I was in the hospital, that was what really brought this to. It was the only time, first time I'd ever been in the hospital.
Mm.
I have been fortunate, um, and I felt so strongly to get out. Like it was, which I think is probably normal. Like a lot of people, like, who wants to stay in the hospital, but it felt like more than me wanted to get out. And that's what made me think about my dad. As much time as he spent in the hospital, being trapped in the iron lung, being, it was like I it was an overreaction to what I knew was going to have an end date to being in the hospital. But it was, so I think that also started me thinking about the ancestral piece.
Did you feel in a way like you were almost having a parallel experience to your
Hmm.
dad?
I did. I did.
And I know one of the things that you write about in the book that again I think is really interesting is when you talk about how the language that was being used around you as far as the medical language and the coding,
Yeah.
written on the whiteboards and things like that, that, you felt as though words had always been your friend and always been your superpower up until that point. And so can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's really disorienting. It's like being, plopped into Oz or something, and you don't know the rules anymore. You don't know how it works. I haven't done a ton of international travel, but I've been to Italy and I've been to Mexico, and I couldn't speak either language well enough to, I could find the bathroom, but well enough to, and so you're surrounded by so much text that doesn't make sense. But it wasn't an experience like that. Like that was a freeing experience. That was like, wow, I don't know anything about where I am. That's fascinating, and I think it's because I felt I was well, and I had some autonomy and some agency. But in the hospital, you lose your autonomy and you lose your agency, and all of the language that you don't understand is about you. In Italy, all of the language that I didn't understand had nothing to do with me. It was just the language of the land that I was in, but in a hospital, it's your new language and they don't tell you what it means. And that's really, really disempowering.
Absolutely. I can understand why you would feel that way in that situation. They're talking about me, they're talking about my condition, my diagnosis, what's being done to me, what is next for me, and I'm sitting here going, what's going what's happening? What's going
Right. Right. And the amount of times they talk over you, through you, uh, you know, and it made me so angry, which I think was good because it further solidified this is not the country where I am going to stay.
on?
Um, but I was really surprised at the patronization, and I shouldn't have been surprised. I was surprised by the patronization. I was surprised by the minimization. The yeah, it if I designed healthcare, it would not be the way it is right now.
I completely agree, and I've experienced things like that as well, and that is really it's almost like nearly as bad as going through whatever trauma you're going
Right.
through at the time or worse.
Yeah. I mean, so many times I would tell my husband, like, I mean, thank goodness that I'm not debilitatingly ill from this because I have the energy to keep fighting them, to keep asking questions, to keep, when the insurance screws everything up, when you have to call and you have to get because the wrong code on there sends it to the wrong place, which sends it to the wrong, all of that stuff. And for people who are so ill that they can't fight that piece, it just runs over you like a truck. Or if they don't have an ally to do that, for them, do that piece for them, you have to not only fight for your life through whatever it is that you're struggling with, you have to also fight for all of the other parts. And you shouldn't have to do that part of the fight. You should have to just focus on your own healing and your own well being. But I did not find the medical system to be about healing. I didn't.
Mm. And that's such a shame because I know that there's so many hardworking people in the medical field and who
Absolutely.
have the best of intentions, but it seems like so many times people don't have positive experiences in medical or mental health situations, and that's
Mhm.
really it's really unfortunate. I wish there was some way to reform that and undo that system, but again, that's so complicated
It's
and
so complicated, and
so
there's so
beyond any
many.
one person.
Oh, for sure, and there's so many people making a lot of money off of it, you know, that have very powerful lobbies in place to make it hard.
So I'm glad that you definitely felt the impetus to feel like I am not staying here. I am going, to get out of this place. Did you really were were you really feeling at that point like you weren't sure that you were going to be able to make it out of that situation and that scenario?
I don't think I ever thought I wouldn't make it. Um, the cancer was caught early, and it had not metastasized, so it was just contained in the colon. So when they did the resection, they got it. But it was so shocking to me because nothing had ever happened health wise for me. For 50 years, I was 48 when I got the diagnosis, um, and we have no cancer in the family. So it
Mhm.
was not on my radar. I was all like, if I'd had a heart attack, it still would have, I'm sure, been a surprise. But all my life, I've been like, that's how I'm going to, everybody has gone out that way, And so
Wow.
it's like, okay, we're heart people. And then my people are heart people. And so, and so, I mean, we don't even have, the women don't have breast cancer. And that's so unusual.
Mhm.
Not to have, really anyone in an immediate family that has, any woman that has breast cancer or an endometrial type of cancer. And so it was just a shock, and it was so fast from diagnosis to surgery that I didn't really have time to even um, really, I mean, do any processing at all. Everything was just about, okay, how do we get it out? Let's get it out. You know. And so it was in the subsequent years, which was when I was struggling with figuring out the book and what to write, if I was going to keep writing, where the haunting of cancer started to really come in. Like,
Mm.
how was something in me for that long without my awareness? You know, what kind of because I'm always thinking about story, like, what about the metaphors of colon cancer? What about and those are so obvious in terms of my
Can you say what that is? I know you put that in a really precise way in the book that's very funny and interesting.
yeah, I mean, if you if you can't let shit go, you can't let shit go. And so when I think about my own psychological makeup, if I were going to associate a type of illness with it, that's the one. I'm always uneasy making real connections around, I don't believe we cause our illnesses, or I don't believe that. I don't find that to be a helpful way to think about illness. But
Yeah.
it is interesting to think about, correlations in terms of types, and then see if you can learn anything from that, and see if, like, okay, well, I have indeed spent my whole life holding on to everything. So
I
and
relate to
so
that deeply.
that is a truth about my life. So regardless of this particular illness and this particular diagnosis, can I change that pattern? Can I look at that and look at this cancer as an opportunity to try to shift that? Um, and I did.
And it seems like that's something that you definitely dialogue about in the book with you and your cast of Raven family, but essentially working through that of I'm not good at letting things go. I'm not good at letting people go. I'm not good at letting go of situations. I'm not good at letting go of things that hurt me. And again, it's just like, oh
Yeah.
goodness. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Totally relate.
Woo! Yeah, I don't think I'm the only one.
Makes me feel like, okay, maybe I should watch my colon health a little bit closer.
Definitely don't put off your colonoscopy when you turn 50.
Right.
If you're but yeah, I know, some people, they even have charts of psychological and emotional challenges and illnesses, and that's a bit too far for me personally.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think there's something to at least be learned about how to shift your own personal life in looking at correlations between the way illnesses manifest, the organs that they manifest in, the purposes of those organs, and what might be behaviors that relate to that. That seems valuable to me.
I agree with that because I also have never resonated with the idea, again, almost more like Louise Hay and, things like that, where
It's
it's
a
where
little
it's
too
more like
much for me.
you're causing this, and it's kind of like, oh, okay, let's not blame the person
Exactly.
who.
It's really shaming. It's really shaming.
Yeah.
And it's that was something that my grandmother had done to my dad, which was part of what pushed us out. Uh, my dad grew up Southern Baptist, and so in that mythology, illness was a sin, was the result of a sin. And
Mhm.
so he spent his life being told that he was to blame for polio, for and to think about what that would do to a 7-year-old.
Right.
And it never left him, that feeling of what did I do to make God angry at me, that he made me sick. And I feel that same energy around the Hay House kind of model. Um,
Mhm.
I, you know, sure, smoking is not a great thing for your health, and there are documented things, but also everyone has the person who lived to 192 and smoked 12 packs,
Right.
and so it's,
Right. Absolutely.
they drank a fifth every, for breakfast, and then they did, you know,
Right.
you know,
Right. There's
and so
always exceptions to
always
those kinds
exceptions,
of things.
and for sure, I think we have personal responsibility for how we take care of our bodies, but they still are bodies, and they still eventually will die, which means something will happen that will cause that, unless we get hit by a truck. Something is gonna turn off and create whatever it is that's gonna do that. And that's natural. That's not sin.
Mm. I see when you paint it that way too and explain it that way, it makes it so much clearer, to understand why something, a religious system like that would be so damaging, to your father as just one of many examples of that. And that it's almost like it's creating, the opposite of what it essentially should be there to, again, to, help people through their lives and, to give them hope and, God is love and, all those kinds of elements. And it's just so opposite of that and so, negating and hurtful. And so you can see why that would really, I mean, I can't even imagine being told essentially like you created this and it's somehow your fault and you did
Mm-hmm.
this and to a 7-year-old, who had polio and it's heartbreaking.
That was a lot I tried to work on with Raven's voice in there, with him going back to that part in him, and trying to exorcise that from him, that shame and that feeling of responsibility doesn't even seem right. That doesn't, of the burden of his own misfortune.
Right. Right.
It's like it's blaming people who are houseless for not having a home. It's blaming, without looking at any other, it's a cognition bias, and it's very harmful. Um,
Well, and
there's
I
a
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I forgot the woman's name, so I don't want to talk about her work if I don't remember her name, because it's so good. Um, Go ahead.
Cognition bias? Was that I was just trying to trigger.
Oh no, I said it's a cognitive bias to blame the victim for their
Right.
misfortune is a cognitive bias. It's a very powerful cognitive bias.
Yeah. Well, and I know you also say that you had found a piece, like a short piece that your dad had written, that he was trying to process that essentially. And I'm not remembering the phrase, you might, but the phrase about how he introduces, um, by saying something like, although I have some emotional scars. What was that line? Do you remember the it was
I
almost
don't
like,
remember
although
off
I
the top
have
of
some
my head.
emotional
Although I
scars,
have some,
I survived polio or something like that.
yeah, it's
And it's
really
like you wanna circle, you said, that as your writer
around to
self.
go into that. It was a, yeah, he just leapt right over that, you know,
Like,
a little
although
bit.
I have some emotional scars, and again, I know I'm not directly quoting that
Yeah.
correctly, so I'm sorry. I don't I wish I had that right in front of me.
And well, and I wish I knew what those, like, for real, what those emotional scars were, because I had to invent them, because I know they were there, because I watched his behavior. Just like my mother's everything is fine is coming from growing up with an alcoholic, and
Mhm.
wanting, and wanting her children to grow up feeling safe because she didn't feel safe, and so she has that trauma that, even in an attempt to totally do it differently, still impacts the children. It's
Mhm.
insidious.
Well, and some of the other pieces, what were some of the other pieces that you uncovered about your family and those sort of ancestral influences that once you started this process and started to look at that, what were some of those other elements that popped up for you?
I had, in 2012, which was before I was diagnosed with cancer. So I do think there were parts of the book that were kind of trying to work their way forward, even before. I went back to Wilmington, and I stayed with my cousin, who is my dad's sister's son, and my aunt was still alive at the time. She um, but anyway, I stayed with my cousin, and I hadn't seen him in many, many, many years, and I knew that, um, we're not aligned politically, we're not aligned religiously, we're not aligned in all the ways, which is, that whole side of my family is very opposite from me in that way. But I've always wanted to fit, and I think some of that is because dad is gone. So that was the link to that family.
Mhm.
They didn't connect well with my mom, so there was not any real, kind of, coming around with that. But my cousin turned out to be, even though we don't agree politically or religiously, he turned out to be hilarious. And we had just, we drank a lot of wine, and sat on the, which was a complete surprise to me. He's like, wine? I'm like, yes. And so, and we sat on the porch in this house that he built. He built this house on the land that my dad grew up on. That was it was my grandparents' land, and then my aunt inherited it when my grandmother died, and she gave it to him, um, and so it's not the same house, but it's the same land. And so we're looking at the same land and the same creek that my dad had played in as a kid, and that I remember going crabbing in and doing different things, when I was little. And he told me, um, what my grandparents did after my dad died. And I
Mm.
had no idea, because no one told me, no one talked to me, no one reached out to us, which was really difficult. And that's in the book a lot, like they did not come to his funeral. Um,
And you said there should have been fried chicken and chocolate
there should
cake.
have
Like,
been
come
fried
on,
chicken
where
and
were you
chocolate and
guys?
cake at the wake. That wasn't, there should have been, um, and that stuck with me. I mean, I could not understand, how do you not come to your child's, nobody was sick then, how do you not do that? Um, and and my cousin, he's just 5 or 6 years older than me, and so he would have been in his early 20s. I didn't expect him to come. I mean, it was not that, but he started telling me about what they were. My grandmother started drinking, and there's
Mm.
that piece in her monologue where she's got Old Crow, this bottle of Old Crow, which, I mean, you're going to drink whiskey. That's not the that's not the one. They're better ones. but, but she was so stingy that she probably picked the Old Crow. So she would drink, and my grandfather just dissociated and would go out to the field, and Steve, my cousin, would say that he would see him crying in the, at the barn. And there's some of that in his in his monologues, you know, about the earth and that he loved. He was a farmer, and he really did love, and was great at growing things. And um, but just getting a picture from somebody else that they were impacted by my dad's death was really important for me,
Mm.
um, because it just felt like it didn't matter.
I can understand why you would have felt that way because it does seem nearly unthinkable that they wouldn't have shown
Yeah,
up for their son's funeral.
yeah. I mean, um, my husband has kids, and and I've talked to him about that. I'm like, what would keep you from your child's? Is there anything short of you're in a coma, or the like, what would keep you? You would find the money, you would find the what would keep you, you know? Um, and so that helped me to at least write a way that helped me forgive it, um, which was beneficial for me. And I, I, if I were older, maybe it would not have been quite as, but again, 19 was a kid, and like, why aren't my grandparents here? My mom's family came, and you know, but you start talking about things, and you find all these other parts of the story that you didn't know. And when my mom read the draft of this book, she's like, it's possible I told them not to come because I didn't want to deal with them. But she
Wow.
couldn't remember for sure. But she was like, I very well might have said, don't come. you know so then
Wow.
you get this story in your head that your grandparents didn't come, but maybe your mom said don't come. And maybe, and then you live 20 years thinking a thing that may not be true at all, which I find really fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to ask, like, what conclusions did you come to from that? So that's definitely one that, I mean, that is really fascinating. And again, it sheds a completely different light on
Completely
that
different light.
experience.
Completely different light, you know and I tried with the grandmother piece, like maybe it was too much for her to see it,
Right.
because they did have a service there, in
Mm.
Wilmington for him. So they did do something for him. Um, but when the body's not there, it's not quite as, you know,
Real or
real, or
poignant or
you know, um, and certainly the older, because I knew everything when I was 19, and then I knew I was right about everything at 19, and forever. And now I don't know that I'm right about anything, and I feel like I have a lot more compassion, which is very healthy, and a gift of aging, and a gift, I think, of writing and really trying to look at different perspectives. I'm like, well, why would someone have done that? What's a way that makes sense, that isn't the story that I think it is? And I think that arc through many different stories in this book is part of what's been so substantially healing for me, is just really like, okay, you don't know. So let's pick the story that doesn't hurt your heart.
Mm, that makes sense. And that's again just such an interesting perspective that the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and about our experiences may not necessarily be the truth with the capital T that we think
Right,
it is.
right, right. I mean, we know how fallible memory is, and how you end up conflating memories and turning things you've heard into memories, and pictures that you see become a memory, but you weren't even there. I mean, we know memory is not not a reliable source, but we make the stories of our lives out of it. So it's a useful practice to keep challenging the memory. Um, in a way that will make more space.
So, would you say that that's why this book is called a speculative memoir? Can we talk a little more about that?
Well, sure, it's speculative because my dad did not show up as a raven. You know, I mean, like that is that there was no talking raven in the backyard.
Although that would be so
Yeah,
cool, and
it's
part of
kind of
me wishes that you really had
I
legit
know.
literally had that experience.
I have tons of ravens in the backyard. I have ravens that I have fed and given gifts to for I love ravens. I have ravens. Um, but um, so that became certainly a speculative vehicle for um, what I hoped was a version of truth, which is all, any memoir is a version of truth. It's not the capital T truth. And it gave me a way to work, work in my grandparents' stories, and and in terms of the events that I have for them, they're true to the best of my knowledge, like where they lived, the way the house looked, what the it was true that my dad's last letter reached them after he died. And so then I tried
Mm,
to imagine what that would be like as a parent to get a letter from a dead person, which gave
mm.
me more space and gave me more openness toward them. You know, that's a harsh thing, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
So why ravens? Did ravens select you? Did you select them as far as choosing that as a vehicle or as a metaphor for
I think they chose. Well, ravens are just certainly mythologically in many different cultures the the bridge between the worlds, goes, back and forth in that way. But there are a lot of gigantic ravens where I live in northern Arizona. But even when I was little and we lived in Charlotte, there aren't ravens in the south; they're crows. Um,
right?
the ravens are the western, and the crows are a little bit smaller. But we would go to a rescue zoo at one of the parks all the time when I was growing up, and there was a crow in you know in a cage, and the poor bird, and I would just camp out in front of that display. And I don't know if the wing was injured, something was, obviously something was wrong, or but it just crowed constantly. And
Mm,
and I've never forgotten that bird. And I would have been, 4, 5, 6, 7. We went a lot to that park and to that zoo. Um, and so I think forever those birds have been, you know, following me around in ways.
interesting. And can you talk a little bit more about the speculative memoir term for people who may not be as familiar with that? What does speculative memoir encompass, and how does it
Yeah,
work?
yeah. It encompasses imaginative elements. It encompasses what ifs. Sometimes ghosts. Sometimes different kinds of characters. All in service to the truth of the story. In my view of it, it's a type of memoir that where the emphasis is placed on the inner landscape of someone more than the external landscape of someone. So, there are memoirs about, yeah, people's adventures, like Wild, like Cheryl Strayed's Wild. That's about hiking the Pacific Coast Trail, and it's certainly about other things going on inside. But that there's a very external narrative, and there's not that much of an external narrative in this book. It's much more an inner journey, and it's a way to bring that inner journey forward. And that was, I think, an important component for me as well, is to recognize the validity of the inner world and to claim it as something worthy of being, yeah, this is true for me. It's not a novel. It's not I tried doing it as a novel because there was no talking raven. So I tried, like, I should make it a novel, and I couldn't get there. And I think the piece was in my heart. I knew that it wasn't made up, if that makes any sense.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so I needed to claim and own that it wasn't made up, because that was also helping to integrate parts of me that had been kept separate. This is imagination, this is real, and the two things can't meet. But they do for me. I think they do for a lot of people. Um, so sometimes speculative memoir is called haunted memoir. Um,
Mm,
it's another term that's
interesting.
kind of interchangeable. Um, yeah, J. Nicole Jones's new book, is new this year, called Low Country, is subtitled A
Mhm.
Haunted Memoir, and it takes place in South Carolina, and it uses the folk tales and the ghost stories of South Carolina swampland, which are vast and rich with ghost stories, and those become part of the narrative and part of the way she's telling her story, and so that would be the speculative part of of that.
So it sounds like that really gave you a doorway into your experience and the story, giving yourself,
Absolutely.
giving yourself that, like you said, that permission and that autonomy to say, I'm talking about larger truths about my life and exploring these family elements that I haven't in the past, and I can't just fictionalize this and make
Hmm.
it a novel, because it's not really that, and I want to get at something that's closer to my
Right.
actual experience. So that's really interesting. And so how is it your theater background that kind of brought in more of the play element to it, with the ravens, your father as a raven, his parents as ravens, and then you, and discussing, these family issues and elements?
It probably was influential. My first professional writing gig was as a playwright in residence, so I have a background in playwriting as well, um, and I was trying to think of how to describe what kind of that other world would be. And I thought, I mean, like a black box space is perfect because you don't have clear, you know, walls and floor, like you're sort of floating in a way. And I did want a way in which I could just do dialogue and not have to have ravens interacting with wings. And I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted them to just have, you know, um, the only place the raven interacts like as a raven is in the lyric part with me. When we're in the stage part, it's their voices and their disembodied ghost voices. And I wanted a way to be able to do that. And that was a play for sure.
Did you ever consider, weaving your mother into this at all? Or I know you definitely mention her, in the book, and some family pieces there, but it sounds like you really more felt the calling to explore your obviously your father's, passing him as a character and as your father, and then also his parents.
I definitely didn't want to bring her family into it because that would change the focus of the book and make
Mhm.
it make it too many ghosts. you know, it would be too
Sure.
much. But I actually think the book is about her.
Mm.
The book is dedicated to her, and I think the pivotal essay is in the two-third part of the book, with us going to New York and going through the Museum of Natural History and looking at the dinosaur fossils.
Mm.
And, she's still alive, but we're all on our way to becoming these ghosts. And
Yeah.
um, and when I wrote that piece, I was like, oh, holy crap, this is what the book is about. The book is about me and my mom, in a way.
Oh, wow.
And I certainly didn't think that when I started. But I think that essay is what the whole book hinges on.
Wow. How interesting. So sometimes the book isn't even about what we think it's about.
The book is never about what we think the book is about. you know, and I've been getting, emails and things from people now that the book is out and people are starting to read it. And you just don't know what you've done till you let it go and you hear what other people are getting from it, which is the gift of reading. Everybody's going to read a different book of this same book. They're going to bring
Mhm.
their ghosts and their experiences to the book. And my story is just going to open, I hope, the door for them to think about their own ancestors and family and the stories that they've told themselves about those things in a different way. So each reader co-writes the next kind of version of the book.
Mm, that's a good point. I feel like another really interesting element that you mention in the book is, you know, having tried to go to therapy and how that wasn't very effective for you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I found an amazing therapist at last, and we do guided imagery together. And still, I've worked with her now for 25 years. But
Oh,
in the
good.
but in
Awesome.
the beginning, it was, yeah. There's that little short section of the little couple little tiny plays with each therapist, and it was like, yeah, no, no, you're not, you no, you're the wrong person for me.
Well, I think you capture that so well that it's, like, again, written as a play, so it's almost like, therapist 1,
Right.
"So tell me about this." Me not saying anything,
Right.
"So tell me about," whatever, like, "Nope," and then therapist 2 is more, writing things down and then refusing to you're not really talking and not really sharing, but this therapist is still
Still
writing.
writing
You're
things
going,
down
"Okay, so what are you writing in it?" "Oh, I don't think it would be, it wouldn't be wise to show
to
you
share.
that, like, this isn't
Yes.
appropriate." And you're going, "Okay, but the this is me and this is my experience. You're telling me that I can't see what you're writing down." And then there's also a part in which you essentially are writing from their perspective
Right.
and putting you know and I wanted to talk with you about that a little bit more. So, you have these spiritual elements going on, and as you said, it's not like your father literally showed up
Yeah.
as a raven.
Mhm.
But when you write about that from a mental health perspective and are essentially almost like putting diagnoses on, the experiences that you're having, and almost like, okay, this woman is, she's experiencing hallucinatory illusions with, the appearance of smoke and, these things. So can you talk a little bit about that, kind of the difficulty in having spiritual experiences, but almost like maybe being afraid to share those because then you're gonna get like a mental health diagnosis or
Yeah, I mean, and because I am a therapist, looking at those codes, right? So, um, I'm not a fan of the codes in any. I would definitely not have been a psychiatrist. I couldn't do that. But the similarity between that in that piece where I'm writing my own imagined DSM, category, and
right.
DSM codes of what was going on, that's a callback to the codes from the hospital, from the medical world, and um, there's still these codes that no one will tell you about. They're writing things down about you that they're not sharing with you. Um, I find it just as offensive in mental health as I found it in the hospital. I feel like, um, and the way I approach things as a therapist is to help people. I want to be on equal footing with that individual. I'm a very person centered. You know, uh, I you know more about you than I do, and I want to just make space for that. But I don't work with people with you know clinical diagnoses with really severe challenges. It's a different skill set than I have. But I think that it's always felt unsafe to talk about what I what I've seen, what I believe I've seen, because it's easy to find the category and be like, mm, you know, that's that, and here's the pill for that, and you shouldn't have that. And when my mom read this draft, she's like, my mother always saw things in the apartment.
Mm,
And, um, and I'm like, "Really?" Because I know nothing about my mother's mother either because she was she was an alcoholic, and my mom and she had a very fraught relationship, and I only saw her a few times, and I'm like, "Really? She saw things in the apartment." She was an immigrant from Finland.
mm,
Um, really? Okay, so then in my head, and this is kind of what I'm working on next, in my head, wonder how that's contributing to drinking. Like, what is she
mm,
seeing? What is she not seeing? What can't she get away from? And in kind of now diving in more into my mom's background, I learned that my grandmother's father died suddenly when she was 3 in a copper
Mm,
mine. So I'm like, interesting. So you know, there's that pattern of father loss at a formative age.
mhm.
Um, you know, it's just interesting. It's just interesting. So,
Do you have any recommendations as far as finding, counselors or therapists who you are able to speak openly with about spiritual experiences? That I know I had heard this question recently in a writing workshop where someone was saying, basically like how can you find someone who's open to this, who isn't just going to do the, again, finding sort of the clinical diagnoses to place on this, because I've had those kinds of experiences too. And when you start reading more about like, oh, here's how this would be, diagnosed, and it's kind of like, oh gosh, like, well, this is what it makes that feel a lot more scary and a lot more daunting. And again, the whole like, I know I'm not crazy, but I know that I've also had these experiences, and how do you integrate that, and how do you find people to talk to who will also allow space for that, and integrate that, and not just go to a clinical
right, right,
perspective.
right. I mean, certainly without minimizing schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder and illnesses where the hallucinations are problematic and are
Right.
coming from a biological source. Um, Alyssa Washuta writes about questioning basically who's in charge of the narrative around what's real and what's not. And
Mm,
she's a member of the Cowlitz tribe, and she's very direct. She's like, let me guess, it's the colonizers who said that the way that I relate to the world is false and the way that they relate to the world is true. Therefore, the way that I relate to the world is pathological and needs to be changed. And I think that
mhm,
that's really important because I think that many people have access to seeing things that we can't quite quantify and we can't quite, you know, um, and some people more than others, but to ignore that magic part of the world, I think that that kind of does some soul severing,
mhm,
and so to not bash on therapists too much. If we don't put a code in, we can't bill, and if
mm,
we can't bill, your insurance won't cover it. So
mm,
there's that tie, there's that strangulation in the industry as well. There has to be a code. There has to
totally.
be something that we can turn in. Um, so so my answer, I guess, connects a lot to privilege, finding people who are out of the insurance market, who don't take insurance,
Mm,
or who because then they're not bound by that. They don't
mm,
um, have to assign you something. And I think it's like finding a partner. You have to interview them and kind of have that initial call. I'm concerned about the direction of mental health care right now because there are a lot of companies popping up. This is not about therapists in general, but there are a lot of
mhm,
companies popping up that are advertising, this some, telemedicine, which is fine, telemedicine in
mhm,
25, 30-minute increments for like $20. The therapists are getting $7. They're supposed to be on call 24/7 to you're like,
mm,
no therapist should be on call 24/7 unless you're inpatient. I mean,
mhm,
like that's not the role of and I see these ads popping up on Facebook and Google and these different sites. And my current therapist, she was talking to me the other day about how bad this is um for her colleagues because it's exploitative of therapists. You can't
mhm.
really create a good relationship and a plan with it's just it's the quick mentality. It takes work. It takes work and it takes time to build those kinds of relationships, and it's expensive, which puts it out of reach for a vast amount of people who could benefit from it. Um, and I don't know how to address that, you know.
Was that a fear for you at all when you're writing, when you were detailing that point in the book of basically saying, that you were describing your experience in a certain way, and then did you have that fear that you would be sort of assigned these different codes or different diagnoses or things like that? Was that something you pushed up against at all?
Way back in the beginning, no, those early therapists in that little one act thing, they were when I was 20, 21. I didn't know about the codes.
Okay. Okay. But I guess I meant more later, and in writing this book, was that something that you pushed up against at all, or not really? You know yourself, and you know what's going on, and so you don't need to look to anyone else for or being afraid, you know what I'm saying, though,
Yeah,
about afraid
no,
that someone else
I'm not
will
afraid of
go.
being labeled something that I'm not anymore.
Right.
I feel, I I'm a huge fan of therapy. I've been very helped by the woman that I work with still. But I don't, I know that I'm not mentally ill. I know that
Right.
I'm not dangerous to myself or anybody else. And I know that there are millions of ways to live in the world that are valid. They don't have to just fit in in this one track.
I think one thing that you're writing about that does, though, is I think it helps to see it in a different light. It helps to minimize that, and
Hmm.
to help to understand that, this is just how one other person might view this who isn't on board with, exploring, like,
Right.
spiritual exploration, or, the magic of the universe, or ancestral trauma, or whatever. That again, it's almost like, again, if folks aren't open to that, then, that's fine, but then
Fun.
they're not the
Mhm.
audience for this
They're
book.
not the audience for the book. They're not the audience. They're not your therapist if you're looking for someone like that. Um, yeah. I wish that there were like a database of
Right.
uh,
That would be super helpful.
that would be really helpful. I will say that Dr. Four on ancestral medicine has a database of practitioners that he's trained in ancestral healing and doing that kind of work. Um, and there are sliding scales available, and things like that. And those are different kinds of places to look rather than necessarily seeking a psychiatrist or um, for things that just are about being human, that really are not pathological, that are,
Right.
but certainly can be made to feel pathological. Um,
So what would you say overall that writing this memoir has done for you in your life? Where has it brought you to?
it's helped me let shit go.
Awesome.
And I think it's helped me claim all that I am. The part, I mean, because just in talking about how you can minimize and push this part aside, this magic part aside, because you're going to get laughed at, and I have been laughed at, and I have been all of these things. And cancer was a great gift in that way. It's like, not anymore. It's okay that I claim the experience that I have in this body at this time on this earth as mine. Um, and I don't have any reservations about that anymore. And I don't have any fear about that anymore. And that's one of the most profound things that I got from being ill. And I think writing the book um, was a way of putting all that together in like I did all this inner work first, and then the book came out of that. And now, being able to talk about it further solidifies you know, um, the power that is there when you no longer hide parts of yourselves.
Mm. So what suggestions do you have for other writers who may be having memoir ideas or experiences that they want to unearth and share? Do you have suggestions for them?
I think that it's important to honor the weird, and to go into the memoir with a question, with a curiosity, a curious heart, rather than a fixed heart. So that you're not dictating a story, you're re-exploring and reshaping that story, because that, I think, is the healing piece of the writing. If you just are, this is what happened to be the end, there's not any there's not any growth, there's not any change, there's not any um, expansion for you as the writer, which means that there's not going to be that gift for the reader. um, it's easy to go in, especially when we're angry or when there's been trauma, to go in with like this closed fist and this closed mindset. But I don't think it serves the story, and I don't think it serves people.
Well, and it seems like that's something that your, Raven father voice, suggests to you at one point. I love that that piece of the book where you're saying, you're like, no, I write this story, I wrote this like, about my experience, and I felt like the hero, and I felt really good, and
Yep.
like it's fine. And he's going like, well, that's great, but you really didn't go
But
into the darkness of it. You're just showing
exactly.
us, here I was and I survived this awful experience and it's all good. And so that's
Mhm.
really interesting too, just that perspective of, yes, there's an arc and yes, there's growth, but you have to be willing to go into those dark places and those scary places and the places that we don't want to admit about ourselves.
Exactly.
And
Exactly. Nobody will believe you if you just stay sweet. And nobody will relate to you if you don't, and that's why I included that piece in there, because I think a lot of people can relate to that. Like, this is my story, and I'm going to stick to it, and here's how I am the hero. I'll always look great in this. And then, but it's not real. And I wanted to just sort of keep like the whole book unearthing and unearthing and unearthing, trying to find um, what the real moment is, and that also kind of comes toward the end of the book, when the character me realizes that Raven isn't my dad at all, but is an invention of him.
Mm,
It's just like, oh crap, really? Okay. And then what's under that? And what's under that? And
mm.
what's under that?
Was there an ideal reader that you kept in mind as you were working on this manuscript? Was there someone that you were writing to other than yourself?
No, there really wasn't. I really felt in dialogue with Raven and with his parents. That was the audience, for lack of a better word.
Sure. So what's coming up next for you as far as your writing and your projects?
My poor mom probably is gonna get to, is gonna get to be the next one. I texted her the other day. I'm like, I'm writing about your family now, and she texts back real quick. She's like, "What do you mean?" Like, well, I don't know yet, but I'm feeling like that's the next book, is kind of understanding that it's another part of the other half of my family that I don't know very well. Physically, I look very much like my maternal grandmother, and
Mm.
the older that I get, the more it's like, oh well, that shape, yep, okay, and I don't. I look a little bit like my mom, but when I look at pictures of my maternal grandmother, and as throughout her life, it's like, dang, I mean,
Wow.
and it really clicked in at menopause for me. It was like, I really see, so right now the book is tentatively titled Becoming Helga. Her name was Helga.
Oh, wow.
And because it's trippy to be in a body that's so similar to someone that you not only did not know, but that caused your mother, who you do know and love, some hard times. And and, what am I carrying cellularly from her? That would be good to look at. So that's what's curious to me now.
How interesting.
Yeah.
That sounds fascinating, and I look forward to reading that too.
I haven't figured it out at all yet. I just am like, I think this is it. And then so I've been gathering pictures and you know, gathering stuff. But
Very cool. So what was your mom's reaction to this book?
nothing.
Nothing.
She
Okay.
read it, she handed it back to me. She said, I'm very proud of you. And then she went in the other room. So
How did that feel to you then?
very, very typical of my mother. My sister and I both joke. We're like, well, why haven't you won the Pulitzer yet? Why? My sister's an attorney. I'm a professor. This is my ninth book. Nothing is enough. Like, what took you so long to do this thing? It's like, what do you want from me? So, she's just is not very. She's not great with expression, and it's why I love to get her to New York, because then she just opens up, and I can see the girl that she was, like when we're on the carousel. I see a whole different person when we go back to New York.
Mm.
So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that at least one more time.
Well, I find that really interesting. And again, I'm not sure if there's any advice in there for people writing about their families, but I'd love to hear it if you have any.
Family's hard. I did not tell my cousin the book is out. I did not tell my dad's family that, um, I think that, I mean, we do have a responsibility to people who are still living um, to certainly be accurate, to not tell lies,
Mhm.
um, to not do all of those things. Like I changed the details about the man that I was with.
Mm.
He's still alive. I know where he is, but I did not want any real identifying, markers around that person. Um, I think it's useful to get buy-in to it, but you're not always going to get buy-in. So then at the end of the day, you have the right to the stories that are yours. And um, and if you need to write from a mad place and a place of revenge, you can do that in your journal, but that's not your book. Because sometimes there are really, really crappy things that family has done, that are
Right.
really, really crappy. And they can't be just excused away or written, there's and
Right.
but I think you do have the right to your story.
So do you think in some cases too, it might be just understanding that once again, your family's not the audience for
Your
your work?
family is not the audience for it. And like I have a sister. I don't know if you read
Yes.
the yeah, and very early on, when it was first obvious that I was going to be a writer, that I was going to be putting stuff out, she's like, don't you ever mention me. And of course now she's a lawyer, so I'm like, okay. and and we have a really good relationship, and I called her before I printed that acknowledgement. I'm like, so I have written this book. Here's when, I have sold this book. Here's when it's coming out. I have written you out of the story. So you don't get to say, you wrote me out of the story. The writing, she's my little, you know, and she's like, okay, but I did want to put in the letter, because some people know me, if, like, know me for real. Like, where's your sister? Why isn't she in this? And so it was a conscious decision not to put her in it. And I think it's the right decision for the story, because it really wasn't her story, and it wasn't about our relationship and, anything like that. But the people who know our family personally, they asked, like, where is your sister? And,
Mm.
you know, as in, she requested to never be in a thing. So, I can respect that. It would be hard to have a writer in the family.
Yeah. I can see that too, but I think it is also important, as you say, to still do your work and be able to
Mhm.
own the stories that are yours and present that in a balanced and truthful way and things like that. And I think that's great that you were able to you know, explore your own experiences in a deeper way that involves, you know, this metaphor. And I just think it's a brilliant book. I think A
Thank
Constellation of
you.
Ghosts is just a brilliant book, and I'm so excited about it. I know that I need to go, you know, deeper into it myself too, but I know that it, you know, will also help me, you know, in writing my own memoir and in,
Great.
you know, and in studying, I think just how you crafted this and what you did and the way that you did that. So thank you so much just for
Thank
writing it.
you.
And
Yeah.
again, I hope that, you know, other people are touched by it as well. I'm sure that they will be as they, you know, pick up your book and start to see, you know, what you're doing with it and the kinds of things that you're exploring. And it's so poetic, and you know, the language is so beautiful and interesting and yet
Mm,
also very real. And
mm,
I just appreciated all those things about it.
thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah. So, is there anything else, that, I guess, just that you would like to add about the book, about how people can keep up with you, or about the coaching that you do? Anything along those
Sure. Yeah,
lines?
they can go to loraineherring.com and there's a newsletter sign up there. I'm also on Facebook at Laraine Herring and Instagram at Laraine Herring. And then the book coaching site is linked off of that site, so it's easy to find if they're interested in that. And but I'm not hard to find.
Yeah,
And yeah,
that's
yeah. I
great.
mean, I only send one newsletter out a month. It's not annoying.
Right, right.
So, yeah.
Well, I highly recommend A Constellation of Ghosts, a speculative memoir with ravens. And again, thank you so much, Laraine, just for being here with us today, for sharing, you know, your background and insights about creating the memoir. I just so appreciate you and your time and your insights,
Thank you. I appreciate the space to talk about it.
and wish you all the success, all so much success with the book.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So, thank you everyone for being here today and watching. Just to give a quick heads up, Author Talks will be on a break next weekend for my Halloween birthday weekend. I'm going to take a little break from the show, but we'll be back on November 6th with Linda Jo Hefner, her memoir, Tainted Seas, My Sailor Story. So, look forward to seeing you all back then. And thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great